Hey, everybody. It is Wednesday, October 2nd. You're listening to the Mo News Podcast. I'm Moshe Winunu.
And I'm Jill Wagner. This is the place where we bring you just the facts.
And we read all the news and read between the lines so you don't have to. And sometimes we visit our old haunts. Jill, I'm here at the CVS Broadcast Center on West 57th Street, where I spent about a decade of my life.
And which last night was home to the vice presidential debate. As we talked about, the first time in decades that a vice presidential debate has been held in New York.
Well, that's the only reason I had to return to the CBS Broadcast Center. I kid. I still have some friends here, and some good memories and some bad memories, but mainly good memories.
Moshe, your therapy session starts after the podcast.
The amount of professional trauma I experienced in this building. Anyway, it's good. I took Lauren Jades, our producer who writes the newsletter. I was like, let's see where we can get into the building. And turns out security was not very tight. So I was able to go into the evening newsroom, the morning newsroom, the digital newsroom, and run into some old friends and colleagues, which was great. And tell her all the various stories. I was basically a tour guide of the CBS Broadcast Center because there's so much history here, going back to Murrow and Cronkite, et cetera. So, I did the tour that I used to give people.
You should have gone into the control room and started talking to the anchors on their IFB, that is their earpiece. It would have freaked them out, I think.
Oh, totally. I didn't want to press my luck because they're like, what the hell is Moshe doing here? Because everyone's pretty paranoid here. There's been a whole rounds of layoffs, et cetera. Some people have returned. They're like, wait, you're coming back? So we actually did enter, I will admit this, CBS people who are listening, I did enter the control room. I did not actually sit in my old seat, get on the headset and talk to anybody, but we were sitting in the back of the control room.
Well, Moshe, we could go down memory lane for a long time, but we actually have tons and tons of news to get to. So let's get to the headlines here. Huge escalation in the Middle East. Iran launched a massive ballistic missile attack on Israel. The question now, what's next? To politics, the takeaways as J.D. Vance and Tim Walz went head-to-head for the first and only time of the campaign season. The Southeast still digging out, assessing the damage, and searching for people missing in the aftermath of Hurricane Helene. Where things stand when it comes to the Dockworkers strike and why some analysts say that the workers could have the upper hand in the negotiations. Sean Diddy Combs hit with a wave of 120 new sexual assault allegations. The lawyer filing the new charges says that people will be shocked by some of the other names involved. In business news, CVS cutting nearly 3,000 jobs. And if you live in Philly, you're in luck. Customers have crowned Wawa the nation's #1 convenience store chain.
I think there's a lot of people in Philly who would say that is no surprise, Jill. Wawa is king there and in New Jersey.
And Moshe has on this day in history.
Jill, your clue today is going to be the day that they're going to throw it back to you.
By now, you should have somehow. I actually don't know the words.
Realize what you gotta do.
I don't believe that anyone. All right, let's get to the news and start with the latest escalation in the Middle East. Iran launched approximately 180 ballistic missiles at Israel on Tuesday, causing sirens to sound all over the country. Millions of Israelis had to run to bomb shelters. Israel's air defense system intercepted many of the incoming missiles, although some did land in central and southern Israel. The IDF says no Israeli deaths were reported. 2 Israelis do have some minor injuries caused by shrapnel. The only death actually occurred in the Palestinian West Bank, where a Palestinian man was killed from falling shrapnel from one of those Iranian missiles. Here is CNN's Jim Sciutto, who was reporting live for the network from a rooftop on a Tel Aviv beach during the attack.
Oh, God. Okay, guys, we got to get off the roof. These are coming down right next to us here. They're coming down. One just about. We got to go inside.
Jill, it was pretty dramatic coverage there. It was about the noon hour Eastern time as we were watching it. And while the U.S. and the Israelis caught wind that a missile attack was about to happen, that reporting happened sort of mid-morning our time, afternoon time in Israel. The Iranians this time didn't go through all of the loops they went through last time, where they called people and they said, here's a heads up that we're going to do this strike. We're totally going to do this strike. This time around, it turned very quickly. Also, they made a point of using their ballistic missiles. These are the fastest missiles and require Israel's newest system, the Arrow system, to get involved because they're coming from long distances. And they basically sent over 2 major batches of missiles. So by sending about 100 missiles at a time, that can overwhelm the missile defense system. So Israel got very lucky there that between them, the U.S., Jordan was involved in shooting down those missiles, that there were no deaths in Israel. Bottom line, this looks a bit familiar because back in April, we sort of went through the same thing where Iran sent a bunch of missiles. That time, they also sent drones, which are much slower moving, easier to shoot down. So the feeling on the Israeli side is that Iran was looking to cause a little bit more damage this time, though they were unable to.
National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan said the U.S. Navy also helped to shoot down missiles that were targeting Israel. U.S. Navy warships fired about a dozen interceptors against those missiles. Officials also say Jordan allowed U.S. forces to fly over its airspace to shoot down Iranian missiles. Sullivan said that there was, quote, meticulous joint planning in anticipation of the attack. And here is President Biden talking about the attacks and the coordination between Israel and the United States.
But based on what we know now, the attack appears to have been defeated and ineffective. And this is testament to Israeli military capability and U.S. military. It's also a testament to intensive planning between the United States and Israel to anticipate and defend against the brazen attack we expected. Make no mistake, the United States is fully supportive of Israel.
U.S. officials had warned Israel earlier in the day that Iran was preparing a ballistic missile strike. Iran's Revolutionary Guard said the assault was in retaliation for recent Israeli killings of militant leaders like Hezbollah leader Hassan Nasrallah and what it calls aggression in Lebanon and Gaza. They are reporting that 90% of the missiles hit their targets, which we know is not true.
Yeah, they sort of just say these things over in Iran. They are trying to save face. And so they don't want to have to admit the failure. They want to talk about the incredible success of the attack. And by the way, we should note, they're not alone there in that neighborhood. Actually, if you just head across the border from Israel into Egypt, the Egyptians actually have an entire museum called the Victory Museum for the 1973 war, a war that they lost to the Israelis.
And just some background here. I know we've been covering this conflict for a while, but in case anyone is just tuning in and needs a refresher about why this is all happening, Hezbollah, a U.S. designated terrorist group based in Lebanon and backed by Iran, started to fire missiles at Israel shortly after the Hamas attack on October 7th in solidarity with Hamas. Tens of thousands of Israelis who live in the northern part of the country that borders Lebanon have been displaced from their homes since then. So for months, Israel and Hezbollah have been kind of firing tit-for-tat rockets at each other. But in the past few weeks, Israel set a new war goal, which was to get its citizens in the north back into their homes. And since then, Israel has really stepped up its attacks on Hezbollah, blowing up pagers of Hezbollah officers, taking out rocket launchers in Lebanon, killing leader Hassan Nasrallah, and this week launching a ground assault as well. So Moshe, back in April, Iran launched about 300 drones at Israel. Those were also shot down by Israel, the U.S., and other allies. That was a retaliatory attack following a strike near the Iranian consular building in Syria. Israel then responded with a limited strike on Iran, which was mostly symbolic. But most experts say that this time it is different. This was more severe. This was a more severe attack by Iran using ballistic missiles, not drones. And it is also now the second time that Iran has attacked Israel directly. So the expectation here is that the response by Israel will be quite significant.
Yeah. Last time we talked about one of the options for the Israelis was hitting Iranian infrastructure, hitting their missile factories, potentially hitting their nuclear sites where they're developing nuclear weapons. Are those on the table this time? Certainly. Will the Israelis go for it? Good question. What are the Americans telling them? Because right now, the last thing President Biden wants a few weeks before a presidential election is a wider war in the Middle East. The Israeli prime minister said after the attack that the Iranians have made a big mistake and they will pay for it. At the same time, the Americans are again stressing to Israel and the world that the Iranian attack failed. And so they're trying to make a point, as they said back in April, take the win here, Israel. Iran, isn't very capable. It's pretty embarrassing on their end that they sent 200 missiles and weren't able to hit a single target here. Will that work? unclear. The Israelis will certainly respond. The question really is scale and when they might do this. The Jewish holiday of Rosh Hashanah starts tonight, one of the holiest days in the Jewish calendar. So will the Israelis wait until after the holiday to respond? The period over the next 10 days is effectively a holiday period. So there will be a question of timing here. Based on what the Israelis have done before, look out for something potentially this weekend, but we'll see again how long they wait. And we don't know, Jill, what is happening behind the scenes here, but I imagine there are a lot of phone calls happening between the U.S. And Israeli leadership. Netanyahu did make a point last night of thanking the U.S. He talked about how Israel continues to fight what's called the axis of evil in the West Bank, in Gaza with Hamas, Hezbollah in Lebanon, the Houthis in Yemen, the various terrorist groups that all work out of Syria these days, as well as Iran. And the Israelis said that they will do everything necessary to continue to take out that axis of evil, all these various groups that have been attacking them on a nearly daily basis in the aftermath of October 7th. As we've told you repeatedly on this podcast, nobody wants a wider regional war. Not the Israelis, not the Iranians, but ultimately in this tit for tat, saving face, revenge, trying to achieve your various goals here. Ultimately, the longer this goes, the more there is a concern about escalation and leading to a regional war, even if it is unintentional here.
Most recently, Benjamin Netanyahu has been talking about regime change in Iran. He actually was talking directly to the Iranian people, saying they deserve a better government than the one that they currently have. Is that something that's even on the table here?
They would need U.S. support to do that. And there is no stomach here in the U.S., nor frankly in Israel, to engage in regime change in Iran. The big issue is the regime in Iran, right? The Islamic regime there that's been in charge for 40 plus years. They have mottos. Governments have mottos, right? We have "In God We Trust" here in America, various things in the Constitution and Declaration of Independence. The Islamic regime of Iran, one of their mottos is "Death to Israel." Death to America. That's literally their motto, right? So as far as Israel's concerned, it's like, well, we have a neighbor. We have a country in the neighborhood that literally says "Death to Israel" and has their army march over our flag in parades. They need to go at some point. As far as what he's been saying here, I think it's more of a trying to divide Iranian public opinion. He knows that regime is not popular. He knows that there have been protests, but ultimately here, as far as the Israeli capability, it's not about launching an invasion of Iran and doing regime change. But I think he wants to stress that ultimately the issue that Israel has is not with the nearly 100 million people who live in Iran. It's with the Islamic regime that's been in charge and made the destruction of Israel one of their priorities.
Moshe, I do want to quickly mention that there was a terror attack in Israel in Jaffa pretty much as the missile attack was happening. So 2 terrorists, one with a rifle, another with a knife, attacked civilians on the Tel Aviv light rail. 6 people were killed, 9 others wounded. It was one of the deadliest terror attacks in recent years. The suspects have been identified as Palestinians from the West Bank. Not clear if the timing of this was just coincidental or at all connected to the Iranian missile strike.
Yeah, that was the deadliest part of what took place last night in Israel. It comes as the Israelis are trying to continue to control their borders, especially from the West Bank there, where they have a very long border. And there have been a handful of these attacks every month since October 7th, while Palestinians coming across the border there. Jill, ultimately, the war in Gaza continues. It's going to hit the 1-year mark at the end of the week. You have what's going on in Lebanon right now with Israeli troops entering there, at least special forces, not in a full-on invasion. You have now this back and forth between Iran and Israel in the aftermath of the Israelis taking out a number of terrorist leaders who were very near and dear to the Iranian regime. So a lot going on right now in the region. They're closely monitoring it in the White House. You saw pictures yesterday of Kamala Harris and Joe Biden in the Situation Room in Washington. So definitely a story we will continue to be monitoring over on Instagram today.
All right, now let's get to the vice presidential debate. Democrat Tim Walz and Republican J.D. Vance faced off for the first and only time on Tuesday night. Walz, the governor of Minnesota, tried to set the bar low beforehand, saying that he is a bad debater. Vance, not a popular pick outside of the MAGA crowd, was looking to appeal to undecided voters. So for both of these guys, a chance to introduce themselves to Americans and make the case really for their running mates. So Moshe, you were there in the building, in the spin room. What are your big takeaways?
Jill, the headline for me really was just how civil it was, how refreshing it was to listen to two candidates disagree while being agreeable with one another in a civil tone. It felt like a throwback to 2012, Mitt Romney, Barack Obama. Remember those days before the Trump era, before this angry politics that we live through today? You could hear a Republican and a Democrat, two very different views on what to do about the country and the world, but do it in a civil way. So our producer, Lauren James, has put together this mashup to give you a sense last night. If you didn't watch the whole debate or didn't watch the debate at all, and you're just listening to it on this podcast, here is about 45 seconds. It gives you a sense of the varying nice things they said throughout the debate.
Well, I've enjoyed tonight's debate, and I think there was a lot of commonality here. And I'm sympathetic to misspeaking on things, and I think I might have with the senator.
Me too, man.
There's one.
I think that Governor Walz and I actually probably agree that we need to do better on this. The question is just how do we actually do it?
I don't think Senator Vance and I are that far apart. I'm not opposed to what he's talking about on options. We've done scholarships types of things. I think we need to be open to making the case.
Tim, first of all, I didn't know that your 17-year-old witnessed a shooting, and I'm sorry about that. And I hope that he's doing okay. So. Christ have mercy. It is awful.
But I do think that this is one, and I think this is a healthy conversation. I think there's a capacity to find solutions on this.
First of all, Governor, I agree with you. Amber Thurman should still be alive, and there are a lot of people who should still be alive, and I certainly wish that she was.
A refreshing tone there. Now, this probably favors Vance in the end. We've told you on this podcast that he's the least liked of the four candidates. Less liked than Donald Trump, less liked than Harris, less liked than Tim Walz. So it was very clear tonight that he went in soft. He had a lot of opportunities to go hard there on Tim Walz, to criticize him like he does among the sort of hard right MAGA audiences. He knew he was talking to the country tonight. He was not critical, personally critical. He didn't call him Tampon Tim in the various nicknames he has for Tim Walz. He's trying to widen his appeal here. And so this debate may have helped J.D. Vance when you look at some of the focus groups. Overwhelmingly, last night they declared Vance the winner. Remember, he's also very TV savvy. He's done dozens and dozens and dozens of interviews, including interviews in difficult places. With hosts that are very critical of him. Tim Walz has done little to no interviews. I think the latest count is 3. They've kept him in a bit of a bubble wrap. And you can see that he had some challenges, especially at the beginning of the debate. He very much struggled trying to clearly remember an answer that was given to him on Israel and Iran. He appeared a bit nervous. He gained his confidence over time. But tonally, he was also Minnesota nice, right? So ultimately, he wasn't as critical of J.D. Vance as maybe some people in the Harris-Walz campaign wished he would have been. So bottom line here, if you were on the fence last night, maybe you were leaning towards Trump-Vance, but you weren't sure. Vance's performance last night might go a ways when it comes to likability, might push you there in their camp with a month to go here till the election. But we'll see what happens. Ultimately, VP debates typically don't matter that much, but given how close this election is set to be, it might in fact matter. So there was no viral moment that you'll probably see on social media, no knockout blow, but also neither candidate did harm to their running mate. And that is the key here. Your job as VP, be the cheerleader for number one, and don't screw up and don't make any mistakes and don't say anything critical about your running mate. And so they both accomplished that. That's the bare minimum. As far as the debate itself, the issues they address, a lot of policy issues that they got into, whether it be foreign policy, particularly Iran and Israel, climate, economy, immigration, healthcare, were among the issues discussed last night. They began the debate with a couple sort of major headlines. The hurricane that ravaged the Southeast, both said they support the people there and want to get them the support that they need. And then they got into the growing fears, as we discussed on this pod, of a regional Middle East war. Both made a point of defending Israel, kind of speaking to the larger talking points of their campaigns, where you have Walz painting Trump as too dangerous for the world and the country at a very unstable moment. And then you had J.D. Vance saying, well, Trump is an intimidating figure on the international stage, and that's a deterrent to countries like Iran here. So reinforcing that their candidate is the right person for the job and the other one is the wrong person for the job. One point that Vance hit on a number of times last night that the Trump campaign has been trying to get Donald Trump to really focus on is that Vice President Kamala Harris and Biden have been in charge for 4 years, and things have not gotten better. And so I think you'll see this soundbite played a lot. You had Vance last night saying, listen, Tim, I think you've got a tough job because you've got to play whack-a-mole. He said, you've got to pretend that Trump didn't deliver lower inflation, which he did. You've got to pretend that Kamala Harris doesn't have an atrocious economic record. Gas, groceries, housing, unaffordable for American citizens. A point there that is polling very well for the Trump-Vance campaign. And he reinforced that point a few times. At the same time, you had Tim Walz last night try to imitate the approach that Kamala Harris took in her debate with Trump, taking many questions and turning them into attacks on Trump's character and his performance in the White House. And that was notable, right? While the two VPs were very nice to each other, they made a point of focusing all their criticism on the running mate. And so you had Vance going hard on Kamala Harris and Walz going hard on Donald Trump there. Now, as I mentioned, Walz was a bit rusty. He stumbled over his words a few times. At one point, he said he befriended school shooters when he meant that he befriended the victims of school shooters, when he meant that he befriended the families of the victims of school shooters. And at another point, he kept confusing Iran and Israel in that first answer in the debate. One other headline before we leave the VP debate here. The moderators, Norah O'Donnell and Margaret Brennan, said they would not be fact-checking during the debate, but they did make a point early on of sort of doing that, fact-checking. It led to a confrontation between J.D. Vance and the moderators after a discussion on immigration. Of course, J.D. Vance has been one of the people who was at the forefront of the accusations against Haitian migrants that they were eating cats and dogs, leading, of course, Donald Trump in his debate to mention that and the whole situation sort of exploding there. So that came up as an issue here. Vance referring to the Haitians who are there in Ohio, in Springfield, Ohio, as illegal. And then you had, as they were trying to pivot, Margaret Brennan try to correct them or fact check them. Take a listen to this exchange.
To clarify for our viewers, Springfield, Ohio does have a large number of Haitian migrants who have legal status. Right. Temporary protected status.
Well, Margaret, but
thank you, Senator. We have so much to get to.
Margaret, I think it's important because
we're going to turn out of the economy. Thank
Margaret,
you.
The rules were that you guys weren't going to fact check, and since you're fact checking me, I think it's important to say what's actually going on. So there's an application called the CBP One app, where you can go on as an illegal migrant, apply for asylum or apply for parole, and be granted legal status at the wave of a Kamala Harris open border wand. That is not a person coming in, applying for a green card and waiting for 10 years. That is the facilitation of illegal immigration, Margaret, by our own leadership.
Thank you, Senator, for describing the legal process. We have so much to get to, Senator.
Those laws have been on the books since 1990.
Thank you, gentlemen.
The CBP One app has not been on the books since 1990. It's something that Kamala Harris created, Margaret.
Gentlemen, the audience can't hear you because your mics are cut.
So you saw that was the one point in the night where they made good on their promise that they would cut the mics to keep things on the rails there. At the same time, you have frustration in the Trump campaign that CBS didn't make good on its promise not to fact check. Remember, we told you that CBS said they would leave fact checking to the opponents. Now, Tim Walz was not really fact checking J.D. Vance there. Either way, when it comes to that issue, who was right? Well, it depends, is my answer. This is a hotly debated issue, and it depends on when you focus on these migrants and how they got into the country and what their status is right now. So they do have this app right now, though this is a way of entering the country even without the app that's existed for a couple decades, and it allows the government to better track people, and they hope that that'll deter them from entering in illegally. If they come in, they don't have a visa, but they register through an app and the government can track them. They then get this temporary status. Once that temporary status ends, though, they can be deported. So as far as many of those Haitians in Springfield, Ohio that we're talking about, they are technically here in their current status through a legal measure. Now, J.D. Vance and Trump are saying, well, that's a legal measure that Biden and Harris have put into place. And though they haven't technically entered the country illegally, they are adding to the ranks of migrants in the country without proper legal status because they're given this temporary status due to the situation in their country and then potentially could be deported once the clock runs out. So as far as the larger question, they have legal status, but ultimately that runs out based on what the executive says and whether they're able to find another way to be in the country legally. Right now, that status runs for at least another year for many of those folks. So that's it from here in the CBS Broadcast Center on the VP debate. This is most likely the last debate, but we'll see. A reminder, CNN has invited both Harris and Trump for one last presidential debate at the end of the month. Harris has accepted. Trump has said no. This is after Trump had accepted a whole bunch of debates, and Harris said no, but Harris liked her performance in the first debate, so now she wants more, but he no longer wants any more. Anyway, it's a long way of saying probably not, but we'll see. That's a long way of saying we're probably not going to see another debate here unless Trump changes his mind and watched last night and says, you know what? I want another round with Kamala Harris.
Time for the speed read. Let's start with an update on Hurricane Helene. From Axios, search and rescue missions were underway Tuesday to track down those that are still unaccounted for in western North Carolina. Cadaver dogs and search crews trudged through knee-deep muck in the mountains of western North Carolina Tuesday, looking for victims of Hurricane Helene 4 days after the storm carved a destructive path through the southeast. With Helene's death toll nearing 160, searchers fanned out using helicopters to get past washed-out bridges and hiking through wilderness to reach isolated homes. Across the southeast, more than 2,400 people are being housed in shelters. That's according to the American Red Cross, a number that the organization says is increasing. The most urgent needs for storm survivors were the same: shelter, food, Wi-Fi, and bottled water. Lots of bottled water. More than 1.5 million people remain without power, particularly in Georgia and South Carolina, where countless trees fell and knocked over power lines. Utility companies are simply overwhelmed by the scope of the damage.
The devastation has been especially bad in the Blue Ridge Mountains. That's where at least 57 people have died in and around Asheville. Roy Cooper, the governor of North Carolina, was pretty blunt yesterday in his press conference, Jill. He said communities have been wiped off the map. President Biden is set to survey the devastation today in both Carolinas, so he'll get a sense of what's been going on. He's been making a point of bringing in media the last couple of days as he's been talking to officials in the region, both Republican and Democrat. More than 150,000 households have registered with FEMA. That number is expected to rise rapidly in the coming days. They're urging people, if you need aid, please register with FEMA. Ultimately here, as we've told you, the president's likely going to Congress here to ask for more money. Right now, nearly 2 million ready-to-eat meals and more than 1 million liters of water have been sent to the hardest hit areas. And the estimates are still upwards of $120 billion in damage across the 6 states, across 600 miles, and we still don't know the full scope. They're still, trying to get through certain roads to certain areas, especially in the mountains there in North Carolina and Tennessee, to get the full scope of the damage. One really sad part of all this, Jill, many homeowners in the affected areas in the Carolinas and Tennessee lack federal flood insurance because they're in the mountains. They didn't think they would flood like that. But of course, as we told you yesterday, you had multiple storms and then Helene come in. They hit the worst part of Helene. And so you saw record rainfall like some of those areas haven't seen in hundreds of years, leading to mudslides and just completely a wipeout of certain areas there. One thing meteorologists are looking at, Jill, was their messaging clear enough? I've been asked this a few times by people on Instagram saying, weren't these people warned? And we gave you warnings even on this podcast, right? That if you live in that area, forewarning, you could see some record flooding, but there were never mass evacuation orders around that area. You're talking about 300 miles in. And so meteorologists are now going to go back and see, how do they do a better job of warning people inland, because they do a very good job on the coast, right? With storm surge, where you're living, evacuation zones on the coast, if you live a few miles within the coast. But in terms of inland effects, that's something they're going to have to look at.
One of the problems, according to these experts, is that it's hard to imagine something that's like never happened in your lifetime happening in your area. So that is just psychologically one of the challenges for weather forecasters when they're trying to express the severity of a storm. All right, moving on. We just want to give you a warning. If you are listening to this with kids, you might want to skip forward a couple of minutes. This story from NBC News, Sean Diddy Combs is facing dozens of new allegations of sexual assault in a series of civil lawsuits set to be filed. At a press conference held on Tuesday, a Texas-based attorney, Tony Busby, said he is representing 120 accusers with allegations against the entertainment mogul that occurred over 20 years. He says, quote, "We will expose the enablers who enabled this conduct behind closed doors. We will pursue this matter no matter who the evidence implicates." He said his team has collected pictures, videos, and texts, and that it involves, quote, "many powerful people and many dirty secrets." Moshe, he says that some of the names involved will, quote, "shock you."
He added the allegations will include sexual assault or rape, facilitated sex with a controlled substance, dissemination of video recordings that Diddy made, as well as the abuse of minors here. Busby said that he's had more than 3,000 individuals come forward to his office with accusations against Combs, and that he plans to begin filing lawsuits in various states within the next 30 days. He will name other defendants at a later date, he says. Among this new group of accusers, 62%, about 2/3 of them, are African American. They hail from about 25 different states, though a majority are from New York, California, Georgia, and Florida. He adds that 25 of the accusers were minors at the time of the incidents occurring as early as 1991. That the events occurred at parties hosted by Diddy, as well as auditions for people hoping to break into the industry. Now, as far as background here on Busby, he's represented victims in a number of high-profile lawsuits, including against BP over that oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico. He also represented a number of individuals accusing Deshaun Watson, the NFL QB, of sexual misconduct back in 2021. A reminder on Diddy, he's still being held behind bars. He was arrested back in mid-September, charged with racketeering, conspiracy, sex trafficking, a whole variety of things. He entered a not guilty plea, and he faces between 15 years to life based on those current charges.
From the Associated Press, a quick update on the Dockworkers strike, with 45,000 longshoremen at 36 U.S. ports from Maine to Texas on strike for the first time in decades. Experts say the workers may wield the upper hand in their standoff with port operators over wages and the use of automation. Organized labor enjoys rising public support and has achieved a string of recent victories in other industries. And they've also got the backing of President Joe Biden and his very pro-union administration. Their negotiating stand is likely further strengthened from having the nation's supply chain of goods already under pressure from the effects of Hurricane Helene, which has coincided with the peak shipping season for holiday goods.
Yeah, the workers here know they have some leverage. There's concern, though, when it comes to these ports, that the U.S. is already behind when it comes to automation. We're much less efficient than some ports around the world because we haven't embraced automation, because the unions have been against automation, because automated robots do not pay union fees, Jill, among other reasons. So we'll see how long this standoff lasts. The union is also pointing out that there have been record profits for shipping companies in recent years. And so they actually gave a more generous contract to the West Coast dockworkers, and the East Coast dockworkers now want a bigger piece of that. Right now you have the group representing the ports offering a 50% increase. These dockworkers want a 75% pay increase here. When it comes to shortages, we shall see. But Jill, this could start to impact some of the things we mentioned yesterday, the produce and other items fairly quickly here. Consumers, though, you might not notice stuff in stores till next week or 2 weeks from now. And even if the strike ends, the amount of time it'll take to get things moving again might take a while. So if we're talking about impact here, we're talking about mid-October to late October, depending on how long this goes.
Well, Moshe, yours truly has already been stocking up on bananas.
Frozen bananas, yes.
I bought about 5 bunches of bananas of varying ripeness. I also bought some frozen fruit as well. And I know it seems silly, but my kids live on bananas, and I use it in basically everything I make for them. So it could have a big impact.
Right. We talked about that, but I mean, there's a number of things: chocolate, coffee, a lot of goods, small retailers expecting stuff from abroad, car parts. I was talking to a mechanic who's worried about being able to repair cars because of the amount of foreign cars, even American cars that have parts that come from abroad. And then I was talking to a medical worker, Jill, and they've been warned in some hospitals that some medications, they might experience a shortage depending on which are coming from abroad and which ones they might pay extra to have flown over so they're not coming by ship. So there's a lot of things that we might be surprised in coming weeks if these things last a while, where we see shortages. You're like, oh, I didn't know that came through an East Coast port.
From Fox Business, CVS Health announced that it'll cut 2,900 jobs as part of a cost-cutting plan. The layoffs mostly affect corporate positions. More than 300,000 people work for CVS, so this cut represents about 1% of the company's workforce. The job cuts will not affect frontline jobs at CVS stores, pharmacies, or distribution centers, according to a spokesperson, which is good news because there are a lot of reports about how those pharmacists are already extremely overworked.
Yeah, the pharmacies are looking at developing a pharmacies union so they can better advocate for their needs. Right now, CVS is looking at ways to save $2 billion over the coming years.
From CNBC, Wawa's hoagies can't be beat. The popular Philadelphia chain topped the American Customer Satisfaction Index's first ever convenience store study. It ranked Americans' favorite spots to refill their gas tanks and their bellies. The stores were ranked on the convenience of their hours and locations, the freshness of their coffee, the quality of their food, wait times, and checkout speeds. The most popular convenience stores, according to the study, are the ones that have focused on making food and making it well, as consumers are focused more on the in-store experience when deciding where to fill up.
If you've been to a Wawa, you know that they have a whole variety of things that they offer there at the convenience store. They have sandwiches, pizza, quesadillas, but also smoothies, shakes, baked goods, fresh fruit. Jill, there are some countries where you can actually eat pretty well at gas stations and convenience stores. And so Wawa probably taking a page from that. As far as the rest of the list, Wawa number 1, Quick Trip number 2. And then going down the list, I think I've been to a Buc-ee's, a Sheetz. And then farther down, you got Quick Trip, Cumberland Farms, and Speedway, Jill. Bottom of the top 10 list there.
Basically none of the ones that we have in New York.
Well, New Yorkers are tough critics, apparently. None of your regular New York places. It's sort of like, it reminds me of my Uber rating when I go to other cities. They're like, ooh, you're a 4 point whatever. And I'm like, yeah. They're like, you must be from New York. I'm like, how do you know? They're like, you guys are so tough on each other. You guys are tough on the drivers. The drivers are tough on you.
Really?
Yeah. You go to a bunch of cities and it's like 5, 5, 5, 5. Everyone has 5s. In New York, we're like, this ride sucks. This guy tried to talk to me. The driver tried to talk to me. He gets a 1.
Moshe, that is why they say if you can make it here, you can make it anywhere.
That's what they say. That's what they sing. All right. Now time for On This Day in History. The first Peanuts comic strip was published today in 1950. Snoopy didn't make the first one, but he did appear just 2 days later, and we haven't had to say goodbye to him. On this day in 1967, Thurgood Marshall was sworn in as an Associate Justice on the Supreme Court. He became the first black member of the court. He, of course, was an American lawyer, civil rights activist, and argued a number of cases before the court. And there's an interesting backstory there. I won't go too deep into it, but LBJ pulled a whole scheme to basically get someone off the Supreme Court so he could appoint Marshall as the first black member.
Highly recommend if you are not familiar with Thurgood Marshall, the biopic. It's actually on Netflix. Chadwick Boseman plays him. It's great. And for me, I learned a lot about him that I hadn't known before. So recommend.
And we end here with some pop culture. On this day in 2001, Scrubs, the TV show, premiered. I knew some people who were big fans of that show, Jill. And on this day in 1995, Oasis released their record-breaking sophomore album, What's the Story, Morning Glory, Champagne Supernova, Wonderwall, sold lots of copies. And as we told you, they're back on tour. And they're not just going to tour in Europe, Jill. The brothers, Gallagher, think they're going to get along long enough to also make it here to North America. So there's some U.S. dates out in 2025 if you want to go check them out.
What is the over-under on them
Do they make it
to the U.S.?
I don't know. We're going to see. But they're apparently pretty confident.
Okay, thank you for listening to this edition of the Mo News podcast. If you like what you hear, share this with your friends. It will help us grow. Follow us and subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and review us in the App Store.
See you guys.